Let me welcome you to the 7th episode of our series on the Psalms. And of course, this week we're going to be continuing by looking at the 7th Psalm. An interesting psalm because it's attributed to a person called Cush, who's described as a Benjamite. And it is some kind of interaction with David that leads him to write this psalm. So again, I'm going to read this psalm to you. And again, I'm reading from the New Revised Standard Version. And this is what it says in Psalm 7. O Lord my God, in you I take refuge. Save me from all my pursuers and deliver me. Or like a lion, they will tear me apart. They will drag me away with no one to rescue. O Lord my God, if I have done this, if there is wrong in my hands, if I have repaid my ally with harm, or plundered my foe without cause, then let the enemy pursue and overtake me, trample my life to the ground, and lay my soul in the dust. Rise up, O Lord, in your anger. Lift yourself up against the fury of my enemies. Awake, O my God. You have appointed a judgment. Let the assembly of the peoples be gathered around you. The Lord judges the peoples. Judge me, O Lord, according to my righteousness and according to the integrity that is in me. Or let the evil of the wicked come to an end, but establish the righteous who test the minds and hearts, O righteous God. God is my shield, who saves the upright in heart. God is a righteous judge and a God who has indignation every day. If one does not repent, God will whet his sword. He has bent and strung his bow. He has prepared his deadly weapons, making his arrows fiery shafts. See how they conceive evil and are pregnant with mischief and bring forth lies. They make a pit, digging it out, and fall into the hole that they have made. Their mischief returns upon their own heads, and on their own heads their violence descends. I will give to the Lord the thanks due to his righteousness, and sing praise to the name of the Lord the Most High. It's a very typical psalm of David's, starting with an element of consternation, difficulty, bringing it through to a place of great confidence and celebration, which is a cycle, as I've said many times. It's a cycle you see regularly occurring in the Psalms. It's starting to give you a picture of how David dealt with life, with trouble, with difficulty, with unexplainables. Each of us have a system that we adopt when we fall into troubled times. For some people, it's deeply pessimistic. They just retreat within themselves. Everything is bad, everything is black, and it's a kind of an outlook that says, nothing's ever going to get any better. And then other people are amazingly optimistic. They are just constantly believing that everything will get better and everything will continue in a way that kind of just as it's always done. And there's that over positivity that even circumstances wouldn't warrant. And so it's important when we look at these psalms that we don't only look at the words, but we adopt and look at the methods that David uses again and again as he approaches each particular situation in his life. In this particular psalm, he's talking about Cush, a Benjamite. That's the introductory bit we're given at the beginning. Shame, we haven't actually been given any details about who this Cush is. Some people have projected that possibly it could have been Saul himself, given the conflict David had over many years with Saul. But most commentators would say that's probably a bit of a far-fetched conclusion. Some would say it was Shimei. You remember Shimei? When David in Psalm 3 was reflecting on the difficult experience with Absalom. You remember that as he is fleeing from Jerusalem because Absalom's approaching, Shimei is the one who curses him. In fact, David's men said, let us do you a favour, David, and take this guy's head off, basically. And David said, no, if God has sent him to curse, let him curse. And some people think that's probably the person referred to here in Cush. But probably the more probable interpretation of Cush, as other thoughts and writers have said, is that it's probably some unknown guy who at some point in David's life became a real source of perplexity to him. He slandered him. Now, I can appreciate some of this. Many years ago when I was in youth work, I remember trying to deal with a situation with two particular young people who had lied to their parents and ended up doing something very different than they should have done that night. And I stepped in thinking I was being Mr. Hero, only to face huge backlash the day after by the parents. Everything had been completely misconstrued to the point that my name was mud, basically. And I remember it really shocking me and setting me back, because I actually thought I was doing something pretty good for them. This is how David feels. In verses 1 and 2, the dilemma he's in is that he feels that he's been kind of cursed in some way, maligned or ridiculed or lied about, and kind of just made to appear something very much that he's not. I don't think there's a person on the planet who could not kind of relate to David's feelings. There are times in all of our lives when we are accused of being something that we don't feel we are. We're thought of in a way that shocks us, because we always see ourselves in a certain way, don't we? And when that is contradicted by people, and particularly people who we think know us, then that's hard to digest. There's a piece in 1 Samuel 24:7 when David is appealing to Saul, and one of the little lines he says is this: "Why listen to men bad-mouthing me?" This is the theme of verses 1 and 2. David has been maligned by another source, and it's deeply impacting him. Verses 3 and 5 are very interesting, 3, 4 and 5 rather, because this is David's knee-jerk response. When you are slandered, when somebody maligns you or says something even you might consider deeply false against you, what is your knee-jerk reaction to those moments? Now, for some of us, it's defensive. We immediately go into defending ourselves, reinforcing what we think of ourselves, or even bad-mouthing the other person as a way of getting back on them. In other words, there's some way in which we're saying, I'm not going to stand for that. They're not going to get away with this. I'm going to make sure that I say what I want to say. What is really interesting is David's knee-jerk reaction in verse 3, because what he does is this, and we read it together. "O Lord my God," now listen to this, "if I have done this," you got to stop right there. 4 and 5 carry on from that, but they kind of reinforce it. But what is absolutely critically important here is that David's first response is to say, is there any truth in this slander? Have I done something to upset this person? Have I caused pain? If so, God, then let your judgment fall on me. That's practically what David's saying. Now, it takes a big person to accept that there may be something wrong. Now, that is a theme that is again and again in the Bible. Let me give you an example. You'll recall in the Last Supper when Jesus made that shocking and scandalous statement to his disciples when he said, "One of you who eats with me at this table is going to betray me." Now, that was a scandalous thing to say, because every one of those apostles were thoroughly convinced that they were loyal and that they were committed and that they were ready to die. In fact, when Peter himself said, "Lord, I'm not only willing to follow you, I'm willing to die for you," the Bible adds a little phrase that says, "and all the others said likewise." These guys were willing to lay everything on the line. So to have Jesus say, "One of you is going to betray me," is a shocking thing. But interestingly enough, when Jesus finally calms them, this is what they say: "Is it me, Lord? Is it I?" Isn't that interesting? Is it I, Lord? Am I the problem here? I think that is really telling, don't you? I think that is really kind of informative, because their first knee-jerk response was, but I could be guilty of this. It could be me. It could be me without knowing. That's a very different response to people who say, how dare you call me this? I'm going to give you a piece of my mind. This is David's humility. It was said that Arthur Conan Doyle, you remember as the great author who created the Sherlock Holmes series, as a prank, sent a telegram to his friends, key friends, saying, all has been discovered, flee. And of that little prank that he ran, over half of his friends packed up their affairs and fled the country, only to find out that he was only joking. But he was making a point that actually we live with that sense of guilt, that sense of maybe I have done something, maybe I'm not too sure of myself in this situation. David is demonstrating incredible humility in those 3 verses, 3, 4 and 5. His first port of call is to have himself examined. Now this shouldn't surprise us, because a little later in Psalm 139, of course, you come across in verse 23 David's words when he says, search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my thoughts. There's a little bit of that going on in Psalm 7 in verses 3 to 5. David's inviting God to take a look internally into his life. He's not one to shut down and close the doors and put up the barriers and say, it's nothing to do with me, this. So many times when we feel hurt, our knee-jerk response is to defend ourselves, to make ourselves look a little bit better. But in reality, the truth is, we're here to allow God to examine our hearts, to allow ourselves to be kind of exposed in areas that will be the betterment of somebody else. You remember in 1 Corinthians 11, when Paul talks about the Lord's Supper, and he mentions that those who eat unworthily of it, there is dire consequences. Some of you are asleep, dying because of that. Paul's response is, so let every man examine himself. And a little later in verse 31, he talks about judging yourself truly, making an honest appraisal of yourself. Don't be one to defend and cut off. I think it was the great Greek philosopher Socrates who once said that the unexamined life is not worth living. And I think the Bible would fully agree with that understanding. And so David in verses 3 to 5 is willing to say, God, is it me? Like the apostles. But then in verse 6 to 8, he's saying, if it's not me, God, and this is interesting again, he's not saying, if it's not me, God, then let me pound the heck out of this guy, this Cush, the Benjamite. Let me pray fire down from heaven. Let me pray the ground will open up like Korah and his followers. Let me pray judgment on him. How dare he accuse me? How dare he malign me? Let me be the one who just smiles when I see judgment happen. And that's not what's going on here. David is saying this, if it's not me, God, if it really is him, then act justly, God. Do the right thing. I love it. David's not full of retaliation. He's not full of vengeance or vindictiveness. He's not saying to God, okay, God, have a look inside here, and if I'm okay, then take it out on this guy. Make sure he gets a full recompense for what he's done. David's just saying, God, do the just thing, because he's convinced that God is just. And it's an important element about God. God cannot be bribed or influenced or persuaded by any external force. If God is just, it means that he must act in accordance with his own mind and his own heart. If anything can influence God, he's not perfectly just. Do we get that? He has to be solely able to make a judgment on his own counsel in order to be a God who's just. You think of a judge in a courtroom, and the judge hears all the evidence, and then he reflects, and then he makes a judgment. If that judge in any way is persuaded by any other person other than himself in his own mind and the evidence of what's been presented, then he's not a just judge. There's kind of something else going on that's not necessarily kosher, if you like. And so in the same way, David said, I am totally convinced that what God does, he will do justly and righteously. That leads us then to verses 9 to 11. Because David's great cry is that injustice will not prevail. And this is always the heart of David. He pleads for justice and then says to God, don't let injustice prevail. Verse 11, God is a righteous judge. He will always do the right thing. And part of that justice is disturbing. There's an interesting line in verse 11 that just makes you stop and think, heck, what is that all about? This is what David says. God has indignation every day. Isn't that an odd thing? Now, our immediate response is to say, well, it doesn't actually mean that. If you look into the Hebrew, it probably means that God is sad every day because of wickedness, or that God gets a tad upset every day. That's not what the Hebrew means. The Hebrew word is a strong word. It means abhorrence, anger, indignation. God is angry every day. What is David saying? There's an interesting thought in this. When C.S. Lewis wrote his book on the Psalms, he asked the question why it was that the writers of the Psalms seemed to write with such vehemence and passion and anger against the wicked. In fact, some of their words are almost kind of just wishing judgment on people. They're quite harsh and brutal. And Lewis's understanding was this, that the reason they are so harsh is that they care so deeply about righteousness and holiness. You can't have one without the other. If you are deeply passionate about justice, you will be equally as passionate about injustice. If you are deeply passionate and deeply concerned about holiness, you will be absolutely equally repelled by the idea of unholiness and sinfulness. Why is God so angry with sin and injustice? Because he cares so much for holiness and justice. You can't have a God who is absolutely teeming with excitement and passion for justice and holiness to be done on the earth, and then to be slightly indifferent or a little less passionate about injustice. No, the two go hand in hand. God burns with a passion for righteousness daily, and because of that, he also carries an anger for unrighteousness every day. And that's what David's reflecting on. And then in verses 12 to 16, he's speaking about the ultimate end of those who are habitually wicked. People who obstinately remain in their sinfulness, in their disobedience, in their lack of concern for God. Ultimately, as we've said before, there is a cycle of consequence in the Bible. If we repeatedly ignore God, that does not mean that when you die, it'll just be, totally fine and exactly the same as anybody else in life. No. The way you understand God, the way you understand life, the way you react to God, ultimately will bear consequences. Now, David says it this way, that they make a pit and they fall into the hole, the very thing they've dug. Their mischief returns on their own heads. What he's saying is that as you go through life, you are either building something or digging something. You're either building something powerful that will rebound to the glory of God, or you're digging a pit. And ultimately, David said, you're going to fall in that pit, because that's the consequences of our lives. If we do certain things, if we build mischief, it will return on our heads. And that's a scary thought. Isaac Newton talked about the third law of motion, and that third law of motion dictated that to every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. So quite apart from God, even in a scientific understanding, it would agree with Galatians when it says, whatever a man sows, that shall he also reap. And so David is saying, let those who feel like they can, perhaps like Cush, go around slandering people and maligning people, let them understand that the hole they're digging, ultimately they'll fall in it. And the mischief they're creating and conjuring is going to return on their own heads. And this is very much a biblical theme as you look through Scripture. If you do X, then Y is going to happen. If you do A, then Z's going to happen. It's that kind of, you can't escape that. And David's heart at the end in verse 17 is again what we find in every psalm. There's thanks, there's praise, there's confidence. Why? Because David, having worked through this, having opened his heart to God, having invited a kind of inspection of his own life, having considered the justice of God and the injustice of men, comes away appreciating that ultimately God will sort this out. He will act justly, he will act righteously, and he will honor my righteousness. And that's another theme you pick up as you go through this psalm. In the particular words David says, he says, the Lord judges the peoples. Judge me, Lord, according to my righteousness and according to the integrity that is in me. David was confident that he was seeking to live as a man of righteousness and integrity. And he was confident that God was not ignorant of that, that ultimately God would come on the side of integrity and righteousness. So when we face situations where others badmouth us and they malign us, can I offer you a word of wisdom? Don't be preoccupied in getting your own back. Really, it's a waste of energy and it's a waste of thought. Just turn this over to God. Just trust that God, who is a God of justice and righteousness, sees your integrity, as he did with David, and also sees the problem of the other that's causing you. And that God, as a God of justice and righteousness, will bring mischief back on their own head, if that is the case. God will always act justly. When we are to blame, he will tuck it out on us. And when not, then he works on those who need God to work on them for that instance. But either way, we can rest assured and be incredibly confident that God will always act wisely. So until the next time, God bless you.